Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Notorious Reno Gang, the wild story of the West's first Brotherhood of Thieves, Assassins, and Train Robbers, by Rachel Dickinson. Narrated by Arthur Flavell. Prologue. We don't know exactly what happened that dark, moonless night in early December of 1868. Newspapers all over the country picked up the same story, originated by the New Albany Daily Ledger, and ran it with embellishments. However, one central fact was clear. When the sun rose, 4 people were found murdered in the cavernous hall of the Floyd County Jail. The incident started when 60 or so men of the Seymour Vigilance Committee began the 3-block walk from the New Albany train depot to the jail. It was 2 in the morning, December 12, 1868. The tension was palpable. No one spoke. All wore the darkest clothing they owned, and most had stuffed a red bandana part way into a jacket pocket. One man had a chisel and a mallet. A couple of them had neatly coiled ropes slung over their shoulders. Many carried wooden clubs. Most carried pistols, revolvers, or rifles. They all kept an eye on the large man at the front, leading them through the dark side streets of town. The jail in New Albany, Indiana, was a fortress-like stone building, surrounded by a tall cast-iron fence. One guard, Luther Whitten, stood at the front gate. The night was cold, really cold. There was a light dusting of snow covering the ground, and flakes rising and swirling on little gusts of wind. Whitten pulled his coat closer around him and warmed his hands in the small fire he had built in the gutter of the street. When he saw the large group of men coming toward him, emerging out of the black night, Whitten ran into the jail. About 20 men from the mob followed him in, funneling through the doorway 2 by 2. The rest stayed outside with their guns ready, prepared for any trouble that might arise. "Where's the sheriff? Bring us the sheriff!" yelled the large man leading the invasion. Sheriff Fullenlove was asleep in bed with his wife in their apartment on the first floor of the jail building. Hearing the commotion, he came out to the darkened entryway in his nightshirt and drawers, and bolted down a stairway leading to the basement. The crowd surged forward, and someone shot into the stairwell. "You know why we're here," shouted the leader. "Give us the keys to the cells, and you won't get hurt." But it was too late. The sheriff had managed to climb out through a basement window and was heading across the snowy lawn in his bare feet. One of the vigilantes standing lookout on the lawn shot at Fullenlove, who crumpled to the ground. The bullet entered his arm right below the elbow. A red stain spread on his nightshirt. Several vigilantes ran up to the bleeding man, and one of them hit him on the head with the butt of his gun. The sheriff wasn't going anywhere. Inside the jail, men were yelling back and forth. The leader and some other vigilantes tried to get his agitated associates to calm down. When vigilantes started opening doors, they found 2 men, Neal and Perrette, county commissioners who were there for the night. They were ordered into the hall, where their hands were tied, and they were motioned to sit in the corner. The leader barged into the room where the sheriff lived and found Mrs. Fullenlove in bed. "What have you done to my husband?" she screamed. "Shut up and give me the keys," said the leader. The woman refused. "Where's my husband?" she shouted over and over again. "Don't give them anything." It was the sheriff, yelling in a strained voice to his wife after the vigilantes had brought him into the jail and propped him in the corner of the hall with the county commissioners. The leader ignored Mrs. Fullenlove, who at this point was wailing, and began rifling through the nightstand next to the bed, where he found a set of keys. This discovery sent the vigilante scurrying from the bedroom. Once more in the hallway, a dozen vigilantes trained their guns on an overweight young man. Thomas Matthews was standing guard in front of the locked door to the cell block, sweating profusely in spite of the cold air. "Open it," the vigilante leader demanded as he threw the keys. The trembling Matthews refused, which prompted one of the vigilantes to knock him down with the butt of a gun. Stunned, the guard, who was really no more than a boy, slowly got to his feet and began to cry. He turned toward the door and with shaking hands tried to fit the key into the lock. After several attempts, he got the heavy wooden door open. Several of the armed men pushed past him and entered the main part of the jail. The New Albany jail, a large two-story structure, was made from blocks of limestone cut from local quarries. It could hold dozens of prisoners in cells, solid 6-foot by 10-foot metal boxes painted gray, arranged on 2 floors. A narrow bed folded down from each cell's long side. A sink with a lid, a toilet really, stood in the corner. The only thing resembling a window, letting light in and also keeping it out because of its inadequacy, was a small metal grate about a foot square in the cell door. Once inside the block, one of the committee men shouted, "Where are the Reno boys?" "Show us where the Reno boys are, and we also want Charlie Anderson," cried another, directing his words toward the quivering Matthews. The cells were arranged on 2 tiers, the second-story cells opening onto a balcony. The arrangement allowed the guards to see all the cells at once, and the prisoners could see the guards if they pressed their faces against the door grate. That night, the only guard on cell block duty was Matthews. He had proven he was no match for an angry mob of men with weapons. The Vigilance Committee leader demanded to know which cells needed to be unlocked. "Numbers 7, 11, and 24, whispered Matthews. Grabbing the keys, the leader barked out the order. "Take the guard and tie him up and put him with the others." Then, seeing that the keys were numbered, he opened cell 24, the cell closest to him. "What do you want with me?" a voice came from the darkness of the cell. "Step out and state your name," the leader demanded. The prisoner stepped into the murky light cast by a few hand-held lanterns. He said his name in a low voice as one of the vigilantes stepped behind him and began tying his hands. Frank Reno. Likely, Frank Reno had also stood quietly a dozen years earlier, not in a jail, but as an 18-year-old with his parents and siblings outside the family's farmhouse on the edge of Rockford, Indiana. On that occasion, he would have watched as the town's hotel burned, sending licks of flame high into the night. He would have seen the fire move, roof to roof, engulfing other buildings and sending sparks into the cold wintry air. He would have noticed his father, Wilkinson Reno, the family patriarch, staring at the crackling horizon, unconcerned with his neighbor's losses, considering instead the opportunities this disaster laid out before him. Chapter 1. Old Rockford. Between 1856 and 1860, the town of Rockford, Indiana, home of Wilkinson Reno and his clan, was almost entirely destroyed by a series of mysterious fires. The first occurred late on a cold night at the end of November. A blaze broke out in a kitchen shed attached to the Rockford House Hotel. Flames tore through the room, which was really no more than a shack tacked on to the back of the main building, and then made quick work of the hotel. The acrid smell of the smoke, the roaring fire, and the sound of glass windows popping from the heat woke Rockford residents and brought them to the scene. They watched almost helpless as the flames leaped from building to building. People hurried from the scene, rushing into their homes and businesses, attempting to save something, hauling furniture and goods into the packed dirt streets. Total catastrophe was averted when a cold, soaking, steady rain arrived with the morning light and left smoldering piles of blackened rubble in its wake. Miraculously, not one of the 700 people who lived in Rockford died in that first fire. But John Schmidt's cabinet shop and wareroom were lost, as was the large storehouse of Peter and Brother. The tin and hardware house of Mr. E. Moore also burned, as well as a number of homes. Mr. Henry Peter lost a choice selection of valuable books, while Mr. Harding, the keeper of the Rockford house, saved nothing above the ground floor. The night of that first fire, Rockford was a thriving river town, its main products being pork packed in barrels and corn. Yet, just 30 years earlier, when pioneers arrived in this part of eastern Indiana, the land was covered with a thick and heavy hardwood forest. Settlers wanted to make homes for themselves on this kind of land, believing that where trees grew in abundance, so would crops. In a wry observation, Indianan Ebenezer Tucker wrote in 1882, "A few years ago, timber stood on the ground a burden and a nuisance, costing untold labor and toil to clear its bulk from the face of the land, and make ready the soil to receive the precious seed for the hoped-for crop. Now the value of the timber alone far exceeds that of the land itself." Trees weren't the only draw to Rockford. The White River also influenced the growth of the settlement, providing a ready source of power for grist mills. Once mills were established, homesteaders soon carved out the forests to make way for pastures and fields. In those first years, corn was planted around the stumps left after cutting the trees. Over time, axes, chains, and strong horses tugged and pulled out the remainders of the earth's previous inhabitants. Pig farming flourished. Hogs were a particularly good choice, for they could be let loose into the still vast forests surrounding the little farms to root and forage in the mast for acorns, walnuts, and other fruits from the trees. As winter approached, farmers rounded up the animals, feeding them corn harvested from the fields to fatten the hogs up before they were herded to the Rockford slaughter yards. It was a sight that rivaled a cattle drive. Dr. Parsons, an Easterner on tour through Indiana in 1840, then considered part of the West, witnessed one of these hog drives in Terre Haute. "We stood at attention on the sidewalk, watching the surging mass of porkers go by, a sight well worth the seeing. First went a man on horseback, scattering corn and uttering at intervals in a minor key the cry, 'Pigouee! Pigouee!' All along the sidewalk, at street crossings, and at alleyways, helpers were stationed to keep in line the pigs that were driven forward from the rear by drovers with long sticks. The rear was brought up by the very fat porkers who had to have special attendants, and a wagon followed for those who became too tired to walk. The Rockford Herald, which recorded the goings-on of the town's largest pork-packing house, along with everything else that happened in the town, noted that the buildings burned 3 times. Yet the owner was not deterred. He kept rebuilding because the business was so profitable. Although it had not earned Rockford the name Porkopolis, a moniker applied to Cincinnati, Ohio, pork packing surely built the town. Hog butchering and pork packing was seasonal work in Rockford, done in the winter months when carcasses could be kept cold. An entry into the Rockford Herald gives an idea of the size and scope of the industry. Hogs. There have been some 6,000 to 8,000 hogs received at this place, a great number of which are still uncut and frozen stiff. It's easy to imagine frozen hog carcasses stacked like cordwood on the grounds of the pork packing plant, waiting to be cut into pieces. As the butchers worked, they packed pieces of pork into oak barrels made by local coopers. Before the barrels were sealed, coarse salt, saltpeter, and brine were poured over the meat to prevent spoiling. It would be early spring before the brined meat could be moved to market. At winter's height, the east fork of the White River was frozen, but as the days grew longer and warmer, and the snows stopped and the sun warmed the earth, the streams began to flow, and the White River slowly began to thaw. Flatboats built of tulip poplar, felled, stripped, cut, then fashioned into the functional boats during the off-season, were loaded with pork barrels and launched into the river. Young men poled and maneuvered the boats ever west and south, the waters carrying them as the White River spilled into the Ohio, then the Wabash, and finally into the mighty Mississippi. Eventually, flotillas of up to 1,000 boats a day reached their destination, New Orleans. Once there, the cargo was unloaded and the boats broken up for scrap wood. The young adventurers who steered the boats south made their way back home by steamboat if they were lucky, or a combination of uncomfortable stagecoach and wagon rides and walking. There was no doubt that the slaughterhouses clustered on the banks of the east fork of the White River were the source of Rockford's prosperity. However, they were not the town's sole attraction. Before fires devastated the community, the bustling settlement boasted a Methodist church, a school, a Masonic hall, grist mills, shops, hotels, whiskey houses, and, by 1852, a train depot. It was a stop on the north-south Jeffersonville, Madison, and Indianapolis Railroad line. Readers of the Rockford Herald perused advertisements from local businesses, like W. H. Mason, dentist. He has the newly invented instruments for extracting teeth and old fangs. The Rockford Mill Company has just received a fresh supply of banknotes of the best quality, which they will give in exchange for wheat at the best market price. Those wishing to sell would do well to call before selling elsewhere. And J.P. Fentress and Company, Merchants. Carries dry goods, ready-made clothing, coffee, sugar, salt, molasses, flour, vinegar, spices, indigo, lead, nails, axes, and various other articles too numerous to mention. Community announcements also attest to the town's active cultural offerings. 2 balls came off here on the night of the 14th, a regular ball at the Odd Fellows' Rooms, and an independent opposition ball at Postel's. Fast town, this. And an association called the Rockford Literary Association has just been organized at this place. It meets Tuesday evenings. Prior to its destruction, the town's premier accommodation received an excellent review from the Rockford Herald. Rockford House. We are pleased to see that this house is rapidly gaining a most excellent custom. Dr. Woodard, proprietor, is one of the clever fellows, and make no mistake. Let all who desire to stop at a good house, where there is no card-playing, nor fighting, nor cutting, nor shooting, nor threatening, nor whiskey-drinking, be sure to go to the Rockford House. A robust business sector, a competitive, expanding pork industry, personal and professional services, stabilizing religious institutions, active civic and social clubs, as well as links to a blossoming nationwide transportation system, were all available in the prosperous little town of Rockford in 1856. Yet none of those advantages could save it. Neither would the Rockford Herald's crusading owner, publisher, editor, and star journalist, Dr. Jasper R. Monroe. He would, however, play a starring role in chronicling the demise of the community in general and one family in particular. When Jasper Monroe settled in Rockford, he'd already had an adventurous life. Born in New Jersey, Jesse, or James, names he also used before settling on Jasper, moved with his parents and older brother first to Louisville, Kentucky, then to Valonia, Indiana. His father died in 1839, within a year of the family's arrival in Indiana. His mother died a few years later. This left the two boys alone. A young teen, Monroe enlisted with his older brother on a flatboat running out of Louisville for the South. And, lucky for Jasper, Mr. Folsbury, the owner of the boat, had a splendid line of books, including Byron, Moore, and other poetical works, and the duties gave ample time for study. The boat and cargo, flour, hay, and produce, were sold in Natchez, and when Jasper Monroe came back to Louisville, he variously worked in a mill, purchased and ran a furniture car, and drove a hack. And he worked on his writing. Will Cobbett's Vision, or The Devil and Tom Paine, was his earliest literary effort, in addition to a lot of poetry, which Monroe would write for the rest of his life. In the mid-1840s, he studied medicine and apprenticed under several doctors in Clark County, Indiana, a common way to get a medical education in those days. He then purchased a small farm in 1848 in Newry, Jackson County, where he set up a country practice. 2 years later, Monroe moved his young family, for by this time Jasper had a wife, Adeline, and 2 small children, to the town of Rockford, where he immediately stepped into a lucrative medical practice. Yet, as he set broken bones and treated patients for the ague and malaria, his thoughts were never far from poetry and the politics of the day. Monroe had a lot to say about the state of the world, and he didn't hold back. His style was sarcastic yet witty. He lived and breathed politics and railed against anything he didn't believe in. His patients knew that being treated by Dr. Monroe also meant getting an earful about the evil Southern Democrats and the expansion of slavery. Monroe was a devotee of the Whig Party at that time. His 1876 biographer wrote, "Through the winter of 1855, he found time to write many stories and poems, and to furnish correspondence for our county paper and those of New Albany and Madison. In 1850 and 1851, he published essays against the grand jury system, which are pertinent, and if republished now, would find 20 endorsers where they had hardly one at that time. He was hot against the isms and follies of that day, and published much in a burlesque style, which he is no doubt heartily ashamed of now. Several of his poems and stories attracted marked attention at that time. Dr. Monroe was a zealous Whig, and his opposition to the Democratic Party partook of the bitterness of gall and wormwood, and so in February 1855 he started his weekly paper, the Rockford Herald, with a view of finally squelching that party in this county, if not in the whole country. Not only the brains behind the newspaper, Monroe was also the brawn, doing all of the typesetting and printing work himself on a press he owned. Never one to shy away from a challenge in pursuit of his goals, he hounded his patients and the businesses in Rockford for subscriptions and advertisements. To ensure there was no mistake as to the paper's origins and credibility, he always took pains to identify himself in its pages as Dr. J. R. Monroe, publisher and editor. By the time Monroe started the Rockford Herald, he was firmly entrenched in the Know-Nothing Party. The paper is laced with screeds against Catholics and foreigners, the former because he believed the Pope and the Catholic Church were attempting to rule the world, and the latter because recent immigrants were allowed to vote, and it was these non-natives, he believed, who put Democrats in power. The fire and brimstone, or gall and wormwood, as his biographer later called it, poured from the pages along with national and even international news lifted from other newspapers. Monroe's politics and moral rectitude also extended to the popular evil of the day, alcohol. He started a temperance union in Rockford that held weekly meetings, and he ran the names of the men, women, and children who signed the temperance pledge in his weekly paper. Cautionary tales about the evils of drink that always ended with, "and then he died," ran in every issue. Additional proof of his commitment can be seen in his policy of not letting establishments that served liquor advertise in his paper. A complete image of Rockford, including the saloons and whorehouses and gambling dens, doesn't emerge from the pages of the Rockford Herald. It's as if Monroe believed that if he didn't write about the seedy side of town, it didn't exist. Despite the popularity of the paper, Monroe had trouble making ends meet as a newspaperman. He was forced to take some of his creditors to county court in Brownstown to get some of the $700 owed him. He also continued to see patients. An ad in his own paper makes clear the maladies he preferred to treat, and isolates one ailment that required prompt payment. Dr. J. R. Monroe may still be consulted at the Herald office. Persons laboring under chronic or acute rheumatisms or gonorrhea or syphilis in any of their stages may be cured by applying to Dr. Monroe, taking his prescriptions, following his directions, and paying him for his services. He pays particular attention to the ailments of females, and his assistance may still be had in the hour of their greatest peril. Persons with ague applying to him will be cured promptly and permanently, but they must follow directions and pay the bill at once. Poor Rockford. By 1856, Monroe noted troubling signs of decline. The town had withstood numerous springtime floods of the White River and the vagaries of hog and corn prices on which its fortunes depended. But Monroe was following the development of another community, Seymour, merely 2 miles away. Few people, Monroe wrote, come to this place, Rockford, but to buy goods or trade in pork, while they continually go to Seymour if they want any mechanical job executed, and while there for this purpose, they very often do their little trading at the stores, making purchases which, but for the mechanics, would have been made here. A country town must look to the country for its support. Railroads will do nothing for it, except to give it a sort of mushroom growth. To thrive, it must be able to supply the wants of farmer, and without mechanics, this cannot be done. A wagon or plow or rake or hoe or harrow manufactory is worth more to a village than any number of bales of cotton and calico. Not but what these latter are essential also. The doctor had a particular admiration for the man behind Seymour's success, Captain Meady Shields. Monroe lauded Shields' foresight in the pages of his newspaper, believing the man was doing everything right. He developed a town on paper, setting aside lots and money for churches and schools to be built in this new community. He aggressively supported businesses wishing to relocate. Monroe wrote, "Seymour has been built up to the dignity of a considerable and thriving village by the foresight, determination, and untiring industry of a single individual. To his unconquerable spirit it is indebted not only for its present prosperity, but even for its existence. Unlike the proprietors of this place," referring to Rockford, "Captain Shields does not think 2 or 3 retail stores and half a dozen groceries are all that is necessary to constitute a town. but by liberal overtures has supplied his village with a varied and good supply.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?